unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In a much-cited 2009 essay, economist Lant Pritchett argued that India is not a failed or failing state, but a flailing one. In Pritchett's words, India is a nation-state in which the head, that is, the elite institutions at the national level, remains sound and functional, but this head is no longer reliably connected via nerves and sinews to its own limbs. As a result, India can do things like carry out a census of 1.3 billion citizens, hold the biggest elections in world history, and organize a mission to Mars. But at the very same time, it struggles to deliver basic services, collect taxes, provide security, or dispense justice. A new book by the author and journalist Shankkar Aiyar takes the argument one step further. Aiyar's new book is called The Gated Republic: India's Public Policy Failures and Private Solutions, and it argues that the failure of India's public sector to deliver on its most essential functions has created a massive gap which the private sector has had no choice but to fill. In his words, India is morphing into a nation of gated republics, and the many failures of public policy are propelling a ceaseless secession. To talk more about his book and the state of Indian public policy, Shankkar joins me on the phone from Toronto. Shankkar, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So you and I are talking during a massive health crisis and a worldwide pandemic. I want to talk to you about how India is weathering the storm, but let me begin, by asking you about the basic premise of your book. You argue in the new book that more and more Indians are voting with their feet and exiting the public sector wherever and whenever they can. So in your words, they are creating their own little gated republics. And ironically, in a way, this is happening at a time when government allocations to basic goods and services are greater and bigger than they ever have been before. So for the uninitiated, for those who haven't read your book, who don't know India all that well, can you describe for us, paint a picture for us of what these gated Indian republics look like?
So there is the universal gated community as we see all over the world, which is sort of, people at a certain level of privilege and incomes setting up gated residences for themselves. But in India, it has a different meaning in the sense that, take education. The poorest of the poor are sending their children to private schools because the quality and the access to public schools is abysmal. The sale of mineral water, the sale of water by tankers to city housing societies is the fastest growing business. If you look at healthcare, more people, despite the fact that they are entitled to public healthcare, from the bottom of the pyramid in the rural villages, 63% of people would prefer to be treated by a private clinic, a private doctor, or be hospitalized in a private hospital. If you look at power, there is no city in India which can assure you 24/7 power. So everybody is buying what they call inverters, backup systems, which in other cities are only for essential businesses or corporate offices. And then the most interesting thing, India has the largest number of private security because the number of beat constables is way below the international UN norms. So India has over 8 million private security people and just 2 million cops. Private security is the fastest growing business, fastest growing employment in India. And it's the second largest, if one sort of leaves out the armed forces, then it will probably be the largest employment sector. So if you take all of these services, as Adam Smith had said, the state is obliged to provide these services, which is security, which is water, infrastructure, human development. And all of this, despite these people paying taxes, they are forced to, since the choice is so poor, to go to the private sector and pay once again for a service that they have paid for. And that is the gated republic that I'm talking about. So there are many levels at which this is operating. It's a kind of exodus that is amazing given the capability of the state in other areas and its incapacity to deliver on the most basic functions.
So, Shankkar, I want to ask you a question about the motivations behind writing this book, right? Because the phenomenon of this exodus, as you call it, of Indians exiting the public sector and developing, private solutions to public problems is obviously not new. And when you read your book, what you realize is that this has been a consistent theme going back, at least to the 1950s and the 1960s, maybe even before. So I'm wondering, what moved you to write a book about this subject in the year 2020?
So, take for instance education. The early education institutions were mostly philanthropic or private, and the state came into education following the promise in the constitution. Over a period of 3 decades, despite several efforts, several committees and commissions, the system of education couldn't sort of develop into what they promised. And my books are normally answers to a question that pops in my head. And my first book, Accidental India, dealt with why can't we change? Why can't we reform? And the second book on Aadhaar, the biometric identity platform, was essentially an answer to another question as to how did we manage to do this, install the world's largest biometric identity system. This book came as a journalist, as a commentator. I've been watching what's happening in the human, and it struck me that despite rising expenditure on all these sectors, the performance of the government and the state governments which deliver these services is worsening. And it needed to be pointed out that no country in the world has become a middle income or a high income economy without investing in human development. And this is a point that I wanted to make. And so I went back to look at as to why these things were happening. And I found that it's a classic Indian story. Policy is mostly platitudes, and the plan is a hope. And then there is the issue of the divorce of authority and accountability. The policies are designed by the central government, they are implemented by the state government. The state governments have no say in the design of the policy or very little say. And the center, despite giving the funds, the allocations, can do very little if the state government doesn't perform. So that's why an asymmetry of performances. Himachal Pradesh, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Mizoram do exceptionally well in education. Himachal Pradesh, despite being a hilly state, does exceptionally well on supply of water, on health services, because there is a community participation. Larger states like Maharashtra and Karnataka, because of the pressure of the private sector, have sort of done some stuff and the requirement of employable, skilled people. So there's a slightly better education system. But you look at India as a whole, left of Kanpur is developing, below the Vindhyas is doing well, right of Kanpur is a dark, dark place.
Now, the substance of the book is divided into, these 5 thematic chapters. So you have one on water, on health, on education, on power and security. Just to kind of make this conversation a bit more tangible, let's just start by discussing the state of water in India. In your book, you have this nice quote, which says, an American writer once wrote that India faced many, many difficulties, with the most acute among them being explainable in just 5 words: land, babies, cows, water, and capital. And when it comes to water in particular, if I could ask you about that, you note that there has been a remarkable consistency of failure across decades. So, in your view, as someone who has looked at this, who's been a journalist, who's been studying this, without kind of going too far into the weeds, what are some of the most important elements of this failure, right? When you come out and say there's been a remarkable consistency of failure, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 big reasons why?
So one is assessment of what the actual resources, and contrary to most people, a popular belief, the precipitation levels and the rainfall are more than enough for India. But the fact is that this rainfall happens just in 3 or 4 months. There is lack of storage, and there are temporal differences. What's happened in India is earlier days, water was a community resource and was managed by communities. And you can see that in Tamil Nadu, you can see that in Gujarat, you can see that in Rajasthan, in other places. After independence, the government came into the picture and it started building these large dams. And the formula then was that big is beautiful and big will deliver. Over a period of time, any service that you provide has to be economical. So you decide how much of what resource goes where. And in in its peculiar way, the agricultural revolution happened out of a crisis again, the Green Revolution. Uh, Most of the policies never looked at the cost benefit analysis. So, states which have water scarcity grow crops which require high water, which use a lot of water. For instance, Maharashtra has only 12% of irrigation of the land is irrigated, yet it will grow sugarcane. Haryana, it's mining for water, but they grow paddy. So none of at no point in time people sat down and said, "This is our water that we have. This is how we will manage it. This is how much we will assign for each use. This is what we will grow in these particular areas." And the biggest failure has been the lack of a crop map for India. 80% and more of the water in India is used for agriculture. And there is no blueprint on which it operates. It just operates on, it's like an amoebic thing going on. And when the cities came up, they sort of built flyovers, which is basically bring water from far away, whether it is Chennai, whether it is Delhi, whether it is Pune, whether it is Bombay or Mumbai, as they call it now. Water is sort of piped over hundreds of kilometers. In the villages, where, only less than 1 in 5 persons in India has piped water. In the villages, it depends on how close you are to the water body, and again, the same story of piping water. Whereas there are more innovative modern solutions available now, and I don't see any move towards those solutions. And it sort of beats logic. It baffles me as to how these people who have been denied water for decades continue to be exercising their franchise, are not protesting, are not sort of aggrieved by that. Bundelkhand is one of the most water scarce areas in India. It has over 22 packaged water plants. That tells you the story of how poorly the sector is managed.
The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, in 2019, after coming back to power a second time, announced a new Jal Jeevan mission, right? So a massive new effort, essentially to provide potable drinking water to every last household in India. And it's given a new kind of rebranded central ministry authority for overseeing the implementation of this mission. I'm wondering what the government has to do to avoid this consistency of failure, right? So if the Prime Minister called you tomorrow and said, Shankkar, what are the things that you would urge me to do? You've looked at this. Well, what would you tell him?
Well, for starters, I would say that define water as a national resource, define who will manage the water, which would be communities, panchayats, municipalities, define what the water will be used for in which state in terms of the agriculture crop mapping, give up the ghost of bringing water from dams and reservoirs into villages. First, use the groundwater that is available, and make villages understand and accountable for what happens in their surroundings so that the water levels don't drop. And use technology. There are reverse osmosis plants available now, which can be set up for less than 5 to 10 lakh rupees, which is basically not much money for the kind of money government of India spends. And each village could have potable water. The single biggest scourge in India is malnutrition, deaths of under five children, which is largely because of poor quality of water. We lose something like 700 children every day to diarrhea and pneumonia. This is crazy in this century, and that is because, again, the water and sanitation issues. So if you re-engineer the process, the assessment, the processes, the delivery mechanisms, I think this problem is solvable.
So Water is, of course, intimately linked to health. And some of the statistics that you quote in the health sector are truly depressing, right? So you write that, back in 1990, India's infant mortality claimed about 89 of every 1,000 kids born in India, and India ranked 156th in the world. In 2017, if you fast forward, India ranks 143, so not much improvement, with about 32 deaths per 1,000 kids. And as you note, this puts India in the company of some of the poorest sub-Saharan African countries when it comes to the overall kind of quality of healthcare. India famously spends, I think it's less than 1% of GDP on public health. So I guess the question to you is, in your judgment, are resources the binding constraint on good quality healthcare?
Yes and no. Resources are a binding concern. We spend far too little on health. And again, there's a phrase that I keep using in the book, and it sort of keeps popping in my head, is that much of our policy is biased sentiments and no real plan. And so we say we'll spend, India puts up all that. The issue is not just resources, it is the structure of the administration and governance. Health is best left to the lowest. Every city in the world, the local governments manage health, and it's a pyramid that goes up to the provinces and to the federal. The federal government gives the grants, the provinces design the programs, and the local governments execute it. I don't know who in India and what caused India to sort of invert this pyramid, and so you have a situation where there's not enough money being spent. Health is also about other things happening around you. So if 600,000 people in India are dying of pollution-related deaths, there is reason to look at the air quality policies. There is reason to look at how we allow construction. There is reason to look at what we are doing for mass transport systems. And I think health, water is managed by 7 different ministries. Health is dependent on the outcome of 9 other ministries, what they are doing. So there's a whole lot of thinking required. And unfortunately, one thought that the Niti Aayog would step in and do this kind of blue sky thinking to redraft and redesign human development in India. And it has unfortunately been rendered into somewhere between a sort of Rotary Club movement and a government department. And so they haven't been able to do much, and they have certainly not done better than the Planning Commission, which was its predecessor. I think we require to spend a lot more money, and they requires to be planned. And the real problem with the health is that Indian governments have always been very good at addressing the consequence. So if there are a lot of kidney complaints, you put kidney into the social insurance program. So you think that government hospitals are unable to provide, so you co-opt the private hospitals through an insurance program, which is what Ayushman Bharat is, pooling of resources, and the insurance premium is being sort of handled by public sector insurance companies. The thing is that only 6 villages are covered by one subcenter. The number of doctors in India is just less than 1 million doctors for a population of 1.35 billion or 135 crore people. It is abysmal. So nobody has thought how we can get more doctors. So you have to improve the education system to get more people who are qualified to be doctors, who are capable of being taught medicine. So there's a whole lot of things happening. And again, it comes to this. There's no structural, conceptual understanding visible in any of the policies that are being drawn. And I make this reference in the chapter on health and on education, that every health commission, every education commission is basically the previous commission with some new works. There's no new design.
You say that there are essentially 3 kind of cardinal facts about the public health system in India. The first one you've just mentioned, which is India has the worst doctor to population ratio in the world. Most of India's health infrastructure is based in urban areas, and doctors' time is, however limited, is not fully utilized. But at the same time, you also argue that India could be at the cusp of what you called an ECare revolution, akin to what, say, Uber or Ola have done for transportation, or what Amazon or Flipkart has done for retail. Explain to our listeners, what is an ECare revolution? What might it look like for healthcare customers in India going forward?
So imagine if I have to get a blood test done every week for sugar levels or cholesterol levels every month, or I want to have a liver function test. I don't have to go nowhere. I just go and log in into an app. Some guy comes and collects the stuff. He emails me the report. I email it to my doctor. He emails me the prescription. I can even video conference with the doctor and get a consultation. All of this is possible on technology. And all of this is being done at private cost, out of pocket expenses of people. This is something that the governments can adopt. This is telemedicine is something that the governments can sort of integrate into their system, but they don't do it. If I want, say, a consultation, I'm in Bombay, I want a consultation with a doctor in Chennai. I could do a video, I can send the transcripts, I can send the reports to him, and there could be 3 doctors, there could be a video conference, and I could get treated better. Similarly, there are mobile clinics, there are mobile testing centers. There is scale in India to deal with these issues. I mean, Devi Shetty in Chennai, Dr. Badrinath Devi Shetty in Bangalore, Dr. Badrinath in Chennai, and other doctors, Dr. Reddy, who's pioneered the Apollo initiative. All of them have done this, use technology, use modern methods of management to get more out of the park, get more from the existing capacity. Why can't the government learn from these experiments? And the reason I'm saying that we are at the cusp is that you probably will end up with a whole load of patients, healthier people going to private sector, and the unhealthy, ungovernable parts of India landed up with the Ayushman Bharat kind of schemes. And that would sort of be such a travesty of the whole concept of pool risk. I think there is a central message in this is that governments can learn from the successes of the private sector, the stuff that they're doing. They can go get into public-private partnerships. For instance, and bizarre things happen in India. So government testing capacity for COVID was low, so they allowed private labs to do the testing. There is a judgment now from the Supreme Court saying that all testing must be free. So how are the private labs going to fund this? Who's going to pay for their operating expenses? And I'm sure the government of India was represented in the courts. Nobody's arguing about these. I think this COVID incident should wake up the governments across India, both the provincial governments and the central government, to think new, think technology, think integration. And that's the way we can do this. It is possible because you can leverage the scale.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, and it links to what you just said, which is, it's not really the lack of knowledge that India's healthcare system suffers from, but the sort of absence of urgency, of priority. You say in the book that the inadequacy of India's healthcare system is afflicted by dystopian dysfunction. And I'm wondering, isn't part of the problem, Shankkar, with public goods, whether it's health or education or water, sanitation, that this isn't really an issue on which Indian citizens vote? So in other words, politicians can kind of scrape by with the status quo because there's just far too little pressure from below. Do you agree with that?
But you see, it is true that Indians don't vote on issues of governance. And Indians don't vote on issues of governance because the narrative sort of suggests that you can't do better, when the fact is that you can do better. Kerala has been ahead on education, on healthcare, on water distribution of most countries in the world. Its healthcare ratios are far better than the European countries. Its education is way ahead of even. Our literacy levels are where China was in 1980, and that's how bad we are. So Kerala has been ahead of most of these institutions. Himachal Pradesh has done it. So there is a community engagement that is required. That is one part of the story why the voting doesn't happen. The other is that politicians and political parties have very successfully managed the narrative to other areas, other domains, on caste, on creed, on dominion, on religion, on issues of rich, poor. The fact is, the single biggest cause of poverty in India is how we have designed and managed our human development services.
So When you think about the implications of your book, you have this line in the conclusion in which you say, success in public policy is precluded by three distinct fault lines in India. So you have a failure to invest in, physical human infrastructure. That's number one. You have a divorce of authority and accountability. That's the second thing. And then finally, you have what you call a systematically inverted approach to problems in which, you have the initiation of policy and the design of any program focuses on kind of consequences, which are typically political consequences. Now, some people have said, look at what Arvind Kejriwal and the Aam Aadmi Party are doing in Delhi. What they have essentially done, to paraphrase, is kind of tackled each of these fault lines, right? Do you think that's true? Is there something to this idea that the rest of India can actually learn something from the quote-unquote Delhi model?
Well, there is a learning there for the rest of other political parties and politicians, that you can harvest votes on the back of good service in education and healthcare. That has been proved. Now, can other states replicate that model? I'm not so sure. Nothing in India is replicable across. If you travel 100 kilometers outside Delhi, can they replicate what they did in Delhi, in Noida, or in Faridabad? I'm not so sure, because the capacity of the government, this issue here is the intensity of the approach. Manish Sisodia brought a team together, fixed the education. Arvind Kejriwal was concerned about health. He brought in the experts and did it. So what they did is that they made access available. They funded the cost of that access. I'm saying that with the same funding and with the same intensity, you can do it across India at lesser cost, or maybe a little more, by inducting technology. I'll give you one simple example. The government of India for the last 15 years or so has been trying to lay fiber optics across villages in India. This could be if you had a fiber backbone, you could have telemedicine. I'm in Canada now, and in Toronto, if you can't go to the health care clinic because of the social distancing, and all elective surgeries have been put off. But if I need to sort of go consult a doctor, I go onto an app and I can consult a doctor. He can prescribe stuff. All of this is available, can be done online using the Internet of Things, using broadband, using AI. The data that is collected all over India could be used to predict what's happening in which part of the. A lot of this can be done. I am hoping that what has happened in Delhi gives political parties elsewhere some reason to believe that good governance gets them votes. But the counterfactual there is, it's easier to talk about this religion or that caste and get votes.
So I want to kind of end this conversation by bringing it into the current context of COVID-19. In your earlier book, Accidental India, you argue that India essentially pursues every possible option other than systemic reform until it's basically exhausted all other possibilities and its sort of back is against the wall. Unless there's a severe shock to the system, change simply doesn't happen. And I'm wondering if you're looking towards the future, does COVID-19 provide the kind of necessary exogenous shock the public sector requires?
It's a wake up call for sure, and the exogenous shock. I also say in my first book that the momentum of change depends on the force of the crisis, and so we have yet to see how this plays out. I hope not, but if the deaths happen more, if this access is curbed, if you're unable to reach out to a doctor or a hospital, that will sort of ring bells in the next few elections across the country. But they need not wait for that. You can see that there is undercapacity. You can see that you're underinvested. You can see that your administrative structure is poorly done. This is the time to set it apart. The problem with the Indian system is that you address the consequence. So the whole thing about droughts in India is, the moment there is a drought, you think about how to pay for it. The moment there is healthcare deaths, you think how can you compensate those who have died. Over 100,000 people die in road accidents, so you're not fixing the problem there. So you're thinking only about consequences. I think that COVID-19 provides a perfect segue for the country to think about how it will manage. There are 2 countries or 3 countries in this whole COVID-19 which have done superbly, or maybe 4. And I can list them. This is Taiwan, there is Korea, there is Canada, and there's Germany. Okay. Now they're all on different timelines, but they have managed their healthcare much better. If you look at how Germany has, it has over 100,000 cases, but not the death per million population is not as much as it is in Spain or in Italy, and the way Korea has managed in rapid testing, in aggressive tracking. All of these suggest that healthcare cannot be left to who can pay. It cannot be a triage of choice. It has to be it is an obligation of the state, and the state must deliver. I I think there will be a debate, and I hope that debate will sort of bring some conclusive change into the system. Uh, I stay hopeful, but I'm not betting on it.
So the philanthropists Swati and Ramesh Ramanathan, they're the founders of the Bangalore-based NGO Janagraha. I'm sure you're familiar with their work. They have argued that democracy in India has been really great for nation building, but it hasn't been so great for state building. So in other words, democracy has held this diverse, this sprawling, this fractious country together, but it has also created incentives that make it very, very hard to deliver quality public goods. So I'm wondering, in your view, is there something to this? Does India suffer from a kind of democracy tax?
But yes and no. What Swati and Ramesh say is partly true. In that, I mean, that the country comes together on national causes, on national issues, whether it's an external threat or an internal issue. There is a feeling of oneness that has been built from the time of Pandit Nehru to Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and that conversation is embedded, and that sentiment is embedded. However, there is no conversation or no sentiment embedded in the system on the inadequacies of the state or the incapacity to deal with issues. A threat to nationhood has a political cost. The lack of capacity of the state doesn't have a political cost. Political parties have ensured that people do not come together on the issues that matter by presenting alternatives on issues that don't really matter, and have got a free ride for over 5, 6 decades, I would say. And this is true of every level of democracy. Now, it would be easy to say, why don't people protest? Why don't they rebel? Why don't they vote on these issues? And why don't they speak about it? I think the beyond the general assessment, I think what is the real issue, and this is true of many democracies, liberal democracies across the world, is that the form of representative democracy that we follow does not provide platforms for community interaction. Wherever the representative democracy has provided for community interaction, whether it is in Himachal Pradesh, whether it's in Korea, whether it's in the prefectures in Japan, or in the Swiss cantonal, democracy has delivered well. And in India, the scale aggravates, exacerbates all these issues further. And I have a feeling that this is a narrative that will come to the fore probably when there is more consciousness of where the tax money is going, when there is more education, when actually you have champions for the cause.
My guest on the show is the author and journalist Shankkar Aiyar. His new book is called The Gated Republic, India's Public Policy Failures and Private Solutions. He joins me on the phone from Toronto. Shankkar, congratulations on the new book. It must be a kind of an odd thing to write a new book in the middle of a worldwide pandemic.
Well, the book was actually supposed to have been released just around the time India announced the lockdown, and just around the time the world was, in January, people were thinking this was a Wuhan phenomena. And thereafter, we thought that it was a Lombardy phenomenon. Little did most people. I think the typical human thing is to think that it's not going to happen to them, and that's what keeps the story of human endeavor going. I think now that this is so big, and and I keep reflecting on my chapters on education, on health, on water, and all of them have material implications to how we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. The quality of water, how educated we are, what is the level of communication that will be required to ensure social distancing, what is the quality of healthcare, all of this has implications. And it's kind of makes you feel you were thinking right, and it's still at the same time quite painful to observe what's going on in the country.
Well, we thank you for taking time to talk to us, and be well, stay safe in Toronto, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you. Enjoyed talking to you then.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.